Hey, good morning. 14,495. That's the amount of shoes. So last week we asked you to donate 10,000 pairs of shoes. I thought it was impossible, but you donated 14,495 pairs of shoes. So to understand, if you weren't here, there was a pile of shoes from here to the ground all the way around the stage. And standing here in the middle, I need you to know it didn't smell, which means you brought your best. So thank you very much. But here's the thing that blew my mind. As I stood here, Palmer's idea was to get these on the semi-truck and sent away that day, which means, Paul, figure it out. Got it. So what we did is we sorted 14,495 pairs of shoes into piles of women's, men's, and children's shoes. And then we loaded them in boxes and counted every single one, taped them up, carried them out, brought them to the truck, and loaded them up in under 1 hour. Blew my mind. So thank you so much for those of you that were involved and a part of that. It was an amazing thing. Last week we looked at globally. How can we as the Grove go out and change the world? Today we're looking at locally, but more specifically as individuals. We're looking at the simple phrase, do love. And what does that mean for you? And what does that mean for me? Nate talked earlier about these Thanksgiving boxes. I'd highly encourage you to take one and to bring it back, because here's the other thing we want you to understand. At the Grove, we feel it's not us, but it's also you. As an individual, you are the one leaving. I'm the one leaving. So individually, we're taking the story of Jesus to everyone around us. And you have our permission to steal. And what I mean by that is, don't write me a letter and say, hey, we need shoes for our family. We wish you would have given them to us. Take them. Take the shoes. Bless your family. Bless your neighbors. If you know people in your neighborhood, in your family, in your coworkers that need a Thanksgiving box, take it. By all means, take it and bless the people around you. Yes, we have a community downtown that we're going to take these to, but we also want you to have the permission and the freedom to bless those around you. I remember a year when I got 3 Thanksgiving boxes from 3 separate families, and it was a rough year, and that was the greatest moment of my year. And I've never had so much food in my life, and I remember thinking, that's the kind of church I want to be a part of. So at any point, last year a guy came to me and said, hey, I have 26 different families that need a box from my work. Can I take them? Yes. Yes, yes. So please join us in that. This phrase, do love, it's a phrase I've thought about for a long time, because for me, this idea of living love or doing love, it really radically transformed who I was. There's a verse that I was reading years ago. It's in 1 John 3:18, and it simply says, dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. And I thought about, what does that mean to love? Not with just words or speech, but with actions and in truth. And I'm fascinated by life, and so I've always thought about moments and how we can either grab a moment or walk away from a moment. And if you think about it, if you think about a moment, if you had one shot or one opportunity to seize everything you've ever wanted in one moment, would you capture it or just let it slip? Some of you understand. Some of you have no clue, and that is okay. But if you think about that one moment that you're capturing, what are you bringing with you? You know, in other words, what are the things in life that you're holding on to? Like if you have this one moment and you've got to grab everything that is important, what is it that you bring? In other words, what are the things you value? Or what is your life all about? Now, if you think about it, at some point, every single one of you were born. July 4th, 1969 at 2:42 p.m., I came into this world. And I began living. I didn't think this till I reached my 40s, but I realized at some point I'm going to die. In my 20s, I thought it was impossible. But every single person in this room will die. I apologize if you hadn't figured that out yet. So I remember about halfway through, I started really thinking about, okay, what is life? Like, what does this all mean? What am I doing? You know, if you think about it, you think about this, for example. If I was to take this book, randomly open it up to right There. Someone over here, raise your hand. Little man. Mom just went, oh, my Lanta. What's your name? Mikey. Mikey. What's that guy from? Mikey. Cereal. Mikey. Somebody over here, raise your hand. Don't be scared. What's your name? Cedric. Someone over here. People get scared to raise their hand when a guy in church behind you. I apologize. You still have value, but she put her hand up before you. Jennifer. 2 N's or 1? You're not going to see how I spell it, so I could write Philip Johnny Bob if I wanted. So if you think about this, Jennifer, Cedric, Mikey, if I was to follow them around their entire lives, besides the fact that it'd be creepy, but if I was to follow them around and wrote down everything that they did, their highs, their lows, their beauty, their pain, their joy, their junk, and I just wrote it down. You know, if you think about your life, and I thought about this for years, okay, if they're going to write about me, what are they going to say? And if they were to fit that on one page, what are the stories they would tell about me? What are the stories that they'll tell about Mikey, about Cedric, about Jennifer with 2 N's? What are those things that you're known for? You know, as I was processing through that and I was thinking about it, I realized that my life I was just kind of living. Now, if I was to take all these names and I was to go through each person in this generation and I was to write it down and fill every single page with a name and a story, at some point, this generation will pass. And then these stories will pass on to the next generations. But then you have generation of generation of generation of generation of stories. And as I stand back and I look at it, I realize, okay, I can go right here because I know my story is in this generation. But I literally remember stacking up a whole pile of books and looking at it and going, my name is in there someplace, but it's not standing out. Like, I know it's in this book, and I know it's on this page. And it says in the Bible, your name will be written in the book of life. And I really was at a point where I was like, well, what are they going to write about me? And it wasn't a pride thing. It was really of, what am I doing with my life? You know, I was at a point where I was just struggling. I remember I was getting phone calls from our mortgage company, and I was asking them, could you please forgive it for another month? I remember I had a stack of bills that went back for months. I remember my truck, they called me and said, we're repoing your truck today. I said, okay, I parked it at the church. You need Jesus. I actually really did that. But I realized, wait a minute, maybe I need Jesus. Now, I remember as a kid when my dad, Paul Gunther, when he was raised by his dad, Paul Gunther, and I remember my dad was preaching, he was giving this altar call, and he says, look, if you've never received Jesus into your heart, and if you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and if you want to spend eternity in heaven instead of eternity in hell, raise your hand. And I stuck my hand up in the air quick, because eternity in hell didn't sound good. And so I remember thinking, okay, check that off the list. I'm good. And for years, I went on with that's just the way I lived. My name has been written down in the book of life. I've raised my hand. I'm good. But what I realized was all those years, I knew who God was, but I didn't know who he was. I didn't know what he could do. I didn't know what it meant to live with him. I didn't understand what it meant to take every part of my body and say, here you go. Let's try this out. And it's as if I had to hit the redo button, the start over. I had to take my faith and I had to just chuck almost all of it and say, let's figure this out. And I started on this quest, really honestly seeking, trying to figure out what does it mean to follow Jesus. One of the first verses that I got stuck on was in John 10:10, and it says, Jesus is speaking and he says, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. And Jesus is speaking, and he says, I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. And then I stopped and went, full. What does that mean? What does it mean to have a full life? And as I was processing through that, I was thinking about how I was living and things that I was valuing, the things that I was holding on to in my moments. I was climbing a volcano shortly after this, as you do. I was in Guatemala. I was at the top of this volcano called Pacaya, and I liked climbing Pacaya because if you wanted to, you could literally jump in. I mean, it was nuts. There's lava flowing everywhere, and because there's no rules, it was perfect for a person like me. And I stood up there, and there literally was lava flowing out. There was ash shooting up everywhere, and I was standing on the very top of that mountain. And I stopped and I looked to my left. And on my left, I saw the most amazing jungle I'd ever seen. Greener than anything I could imagine, and it went on as far as the eye could see. And then I looked to my right and I saw this. I saw this complete chaos and destruction. You see, the lava always flowed on one side of the mountain. So there was always mudslides and lava slides and ash and just dirt and chaos. And every time I climbed it, this side of the mountain looked worse. And it kept getting beat down and beat down. And as I stood there, that verse, I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. And as if God said, these are your moments. Right here as you stand here, this is your moment. Every conversation, every place you go, this represents, because you can either bring joy and hope and love or chaos and destruction. And sometimes by just stepping back and not embracing a moment, you actually are bringing harm. And as I stood there, I realized I need to figure out how to grab my moments. I need to figure out how to make that a priority in my life. I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. And then that verse in 1 John 3:18, dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth. And so if I needed to live a life that was full, I needed to pack it full of this word love. Because you look in scriptures, you see over and over and over again, love is the most important thing. Love is the greatest commandment. Love can change the world. And yet, I knew who God was, but I didn't know how to love like he did. And I asked myself, I really honestly asked myself, who will I become? Like when I'm dead and gone, what are the stories that people will tell about me? What are the memories that people will hold on to? Is it just going to be this normal, mundane life? Or is it going to be a life that is full? And so I thought, what better way to learn how to do that than to look back into history onto the certain lives of people that stood out? So one of my heroes was Martin Luther King Jr., and I grabbed this book off my shelf that had been sitting there for years, and I opened it up and I started reading. One of the things that he said is an individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to a broader concern of all humanity. What are you doing for others? And he said this, love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. And I processed through how he lived his life, and it just blew me away. And then I looked at Billy Graham because I loved the simplicity of his messages. I honestly remember sitting through one of his crusades and I thought, that's the worst sermon I've ever heard. Like, there was nothing. It was like 12 minutes of you need Jesus in your life, and if you do, come forward. And then I watched thousands of people come forward, and I'm like, well, where's the story and the arc and all that stuff? Like, and I came back and I looked at him and how he lived and what he preached. And he says people need the basics of faith. And so Billy Graham focused on the core values of what it means to follow Jesus. And that centers on love and hope and being changed and made new. I then started looking at C.S. Lewis, and I would pick up his books, and sometimes I'd read a book like this one, The Weight of Glory, and it would take me 20 minutes just to get through one paragraph. And 16 reads to finally understand what he was talking about. And then all of a sudden, my mind would be blown at the depth that this guy took scriptures. And I realized I wanted to know the Bible like he knew it. But I also loved how he wrote the Narnia Chronicles and how he used this fierce lion to represent God, but also this gentle spirit that was loving. And in the complexity, he made it come alive. And then I looked at Gandhi. Because one of these things they said about Martin Luther King Jr. is that he was America's Gandhi. And so I wanted to know Gandhi more. And this one tore my heart out. Gandhi said this: I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike Christ. And I had to stop and I had to think, how am I living? Who am I becoming? Am I living like Jesus, or am I living like my interpretation or version of Jesus? How do I figure out how to live? And so I began to pray. I prayed that God would bring me a mentor. I prayed that God would bring me somebody that had all the characteristics of these people, that would teach me how to follow Jesus, that would show me how to go deeper, that would really stretch me so that when my life was dead and past, I could honestly say, I've done everything I've tried, and I've gone through those moments that seemed impossible, and I trusted God to get me to that next place instead of relying on my own strengths. And I prayed and I prayed and I prayed for this. Every single day I prayed for this. I was living in Guatemala, and I've shared this story before, but shortly after I started praying this prayer, there was a season of violence in my life. I remember there was a moment when I was following this car, and they smashed into this car in front of them, and all 4 guys in the truck were killed right in front of me. I remember in that accident, this little girl whose face was literally ripped off. Right after that, a man came and stuck a gun right on my head as I was sitting in a taxi cab. A couple days after that, I was standing at my church out front. A guy was shot and killed, shot 5 times in the chest, shot and killed right in front of me, turns the gun on me and begins to chase me. I'm now walking through the streets and just angry at God, just struggling with God. What is this all about? Like, how am I supposed to really pursue you when all I'm finding is darkness and death and destruction? I'm just praying for hope. I want to figure out how to love. I want you to teach me. I want you to bring somebody into my life to teach me how to do this. And I remember it was this desperate prayer. I was walking back into the church one day, and I was really, my head was down. I was struggling through this, praying through this, and I literally walked into this guy who was sitting on the steps of our church. Almost fell over him. I stepped back. I said sorry. He jumped up, and he looked at me, and he says, "Why'd you look at me?" I said, "Well, I almost stepped on your head, so I'm sorry." He says, "Why'd you look at me?" And I said, I don't know. He goes, "My name is Carlos Baltazar. I'm a homeless man. I'm a drug addict. I'm different from everybody. Why'd you look at me? Why'd you notice me?" I said, "I don't know." And he said, "I've been sitting here for hours. I've realized I've wasted every portion of my life. I want to go home. I want to find my family again." He lived about 5 hours away. "I need to figure it out. Will you help me?" I said, "What do you need?" He goes, will you help me get home?" I said, "Sure." I bought him a bus ticket. He gave me a bracelet. I said, "I'll see you later." He goes, "No, you'll see me again." I said, "Carlos, let's be honest. I'm never going to see you again." A couple months later, all of a sudden this guy walks up to the church, knocks on the door. He says, "I'm Carlos Baltazar. I'm here to see Paul Gunther." And I came out, and he looked at me and goes, "Pastor, I told you I would come back. I told you would see me again." And so we had these conversations, Carlos and I, over the next 3.5 years on who Jesus was. And one of the things he said to me that I'll never forget, he says, "That day when you came and found me," he goes, "I was walking throughout the city, and I was realizing how much I've wasted my life. And I was walking by the church, and it's as if God spoke to me and said, 'Go sit down in that church, and someone will look at you.'" He goes, "Did you know I sat there for hours, and person after person after person walked by me, and not one person looked at me?" He goes, "Do you know why?" I said, "No." He goes, "This is a church, right? You're supposed to treat people differently, right?" I said, "Yes." I said, "Yeah." He goes, "It's because I looked different. It's because they knew I was different. It's because they knew I was homeless. It's because they knew I had wasted my life, and they were too good for me. And not one person would look at me. Why'd you look at me?" Carlos and I talked about how Jesus looked at people. We talked about how he treated people. We had these amazing conversations. And it was years and years later when I finally stopped, and I had been praying for somebody this whole time to come and mentor me and come and grow me and come and stretch me, and it was literally like a light bulb went off, and I realized, wait a minute, Carlos was that guy. Carlos taught me more about Jesus than I've ever learned in college or seminary or life or preaching or studying. Carlos taught me Jesus. You see, Carlos taught me how to notice people. He taught me to look up. He taught me to slow down. He taught me how to live. He taught me how to love people. He taught me to believe in the impossible. There would be moments when I'd be driving through the city in the middle of nowhere, and all of a sudden I'd see Carlos standing on the side of the road. And I'd pull over and I'd ask him, what are you doing here? I don't know. I was fishing this morning, and it's as if God said, go to the city. So I got on a bus. I drove 5 hours. I felt like he told me to stand here. I didn't know why. I've been standing here for 2 hours. Like, these are legitimately, that's exactly how these conversations went. He goes, but now you're here. I know why I came. And it would blow my mind. At one point, I said to my wife, I don't know if Carlos is real. She kind of looked at me, and I was like, I honestly think he might be an angel. I said, you've seen him, right? And she's like, yeah, I talked to him. Okay. I mean, there was a moment of freaking out, like it was touched by an angel or something. And it was just, I could talk for hours about him. One of the last things that Carlos and I did is we read this passage in Ephesians 5, and we used to read passages and study through them. And it says this, follow God's example, therefore as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. Walk in the way of love. You know, one of the things I loved about Carlos is he believed in the impossible because he was such a simple person. If we talked about anything, and if he felt like God called him to do anything, there was no questioning, there was no doubt, there was just, okay, and he'd begin to walk. There's a story that I love. It's found in Matthew 9. Jesus is speaking, and it says the leader of the synagogue came and knelt down before Jesus. And he says, help, my daughter has just died. Come and raise her. It says that Jesus followed him immediately and walked out. And then it says Jesus got to the house, and he turned and he looked at everybody, and he says, she's not dead, she's just sleeping. It says that everyone laughed. Jesus walked in, grabs her by the hand, and just simply says, get up. And she stands up and she walks out with him, alive. See, the beauty of that story for me is the impossibleness of the request, of the man coming down before Jesus, interrupting the service and saying, my daughter has just died. You can raise her. I realized through Carlos that I need to live in such a way that I'm praying and dreaming for the impossible when I'm putting God first in my life. Knowing who God is not enough. Getting to the point where I'm bringing the impossible before him is what I'm called to do. When my wife and I moved back to America, after I said goodbye to Carlos, I made a vow that I'm going to bring Carlos into every aspect of my faith. There used to be the statement of, what would Jesus do? I lived with, what would Carlos do? I literally, everything I did, what would Carlos do? And when my wife and I started Live Love, when we started going downtown, it really was not without this plan or agenda. It's, we're supposed to be here, and so we're just going to be here. And we're going to start talking with people and being with people. And we watched that grow over years until the point where we felt like God was asking us to buy this heroin house. And I remember my first thought was, I don't have any money, and we have 3 weeks to come up with it. What would Carlos do? He'd take a step. If this is what you're supposed to do, and he'd just go. And I remember raising $46,000 in 3 weeks. It just blew my mind. A couple years later, I felt like God was calling us to build new houses in this area and move a family from the Grove down there and then sponsor a house for a family that's living down there, because home ownership is the only way where you establish changing a neighborhood and keeping the people there that actually lived there. And I remember thinking, how are we going to do this? Then I had a family come and say, hey, we'll finance it if you build the house. Oh, okay. That's a plus sign. Right before we started building this house last year or so, I remember thinking, I don't have the time. There's no way I can humanly build this house right now. I'm stretched so thin. But this is what God is calling me to do, so I need to keep walking in love. I need to keep going forward. And I remember I got a call from a guy named Mike Savoy, the guy in the fat mustache right there. And Mike went to Liberia with me, and he says, I need something to do right now. I need a challenge. Can I build a house for you? Yes. And so Mike single-handedly with a group of people just built the house. And it was unbelievable for me to see how when you take these steps of faith that seem impossible, how God just continually shows up. Our next journey that we're on is a 2-acre piece of land down there where the people in the community have said, hey, can you have a place so that we can have quinceañeras and weddings, and can you build a community center and a commercial kitchen and a place where we can learn how to do blue-collar stuff like construction and steelwork and have an art area? And can you guys live on this land too? Yeah. No idea how we're going to do that. But when you walk in love, it's just this impossible journey. I have one more story about Carlos. There's a band here at the Grove called Safe Haven when I first came here. They're from Guatemala, and after I was here a couple years, they said, hey, we're going down to Guatemala. We're going to do 2 weeks of shows down there. Do you need anything? Do you want anything? I said, yeah, find Carlos. They're like, how? I'm like, I don't know. Here's a picture of him. They're like, Paul, there's like 12 million people. I said, I think he lives on the west side of the country. And I'm not kidding you, that's almost exactly how the conversation went. So they were on the radio, they played all these shows, and it was kind of funny because everywhere they went, they said, hey, if anybody knows who Carlos Baltazar is, we'd love to meet him. There's like 40 Carlos Baltazars in every single city. On the last night they were there, they called me and they said, Paul, we're sorry, we looked everywhere. We couldn't find him. We're at our hotel, our driver just dropped us off. And I was like, it's fine. Hung up the phone, and I told my wife, I'm like, I really honestly believed they were going to find Carlos. Like everything in me, I can't honestly believe that they didn't find him. She's like, I know. I'm like, and I was really depressed for about 15 minutes, because then my phone rang again. And it was Gil from the band. He says, you're not going to believe this. I said, I absolutely am. And he goes, our driver dropped us off, and he went down to Zone 1, which is kind of the rough part of Guatemala City. He went into McDonald's. He ordered a Big Mac. Don't know why that part matters of the story. But then he said he turned around after he got his order, and this guy walked by the window. And so our driver ran outside and yelled at the man, are you Carlos Baltazar? Carlos went like this, which means, I don't know who you are. And so he said, are you Carlos Baltazar? Carlos goes like this, and the guy goes, do you know who Paul Gunther is? And they said, Carlos just started to weep. He says, Pastor, is he here? And so he says, no, but we have this band, his friends are here. And so the band got in a cab, went down to McDonald's, and called me on the phone. They said, hey, we got Carlos. Do you want to talk to him? I'm like, yeah. Carlos gets on the phone, he goes, Pastor, you remember when you looked at me? Why'd you look at me? You think about how we live. You think about these moments. You think how powerful it is to follow Jesus. And yet we don't grasp those moments. Every single one of you, hopefully in your bulletin, has a red piece of paper. And here's what I want to encourage you, to take this and to write your name on it. And to put it up somewhere in your house. The band is going to sing a song, and one of the lines are, I will call upon your name. I used to call upon my own name, and I couldn't figure out why my faith wasn't growing. In reality, I was making my life safe and simple. And I was taking my moments, and I was going through my faith moments by making myself the champion. In reality, we're called to call on God. The thing is, if you think about this, if this represents your life, and you stack it in the lives of all the other people around you, when you die and you pass, that life stands out. That story is strong, it's powerful. We don't value who we are enough. Every single person in this room has been called to live differently, to live bigger, to dream the impossible, to understand that God is reaching out to each and every single one of you, and he's simply saying to you, walk in love. Stop sitting back. Stop sitting down. Stop staying where you are and walk in love. Because when you do that, you can radically transform the world. Thank you.